you for attending, and thank you, Alistair, for hosting me and Australian Institute of International Affairs. I guess I should say thank you to Edinburgh University Press for having this work. I'll say thanks to David, because David was my PhD supervisor. We're in the trenches together for a number of years, and I'm surprised he hasn't got more white hair because just because I was in Turkey for nearly a year in 2016. So when everything really exploded, and David was constantly yelling down the phone to me to come back to Oz, and I constantly refused. So yeah, he put the hard word on me a number of times. Also, my lovely partner, girlfriend, Nellie. I don't normally get this emotional, but thank you. And everyone else that's attended here in person and online. Yeah, so sorry about that moment. I'm not the most emotional person, but I guess there's stuff that happens subconsciously and just blurts out. Yeah, all right. So this study pretty much started 2015 officially. So with my PhD, and what led me down this role is what was happening in Turkey from 2010 onwards, the increasing repression, this authoritarian slide. I guess what you could sort of start from 2014, really obviously. But also being a child of Turkish migrants, having had that lived experience, having lived in Turkey through the early 80s during the coup period, and also the transition back to multi-party politics with the leadership of election of Turgut Özal. And having seen how unstable and crisis within Turkish politics were, got me thinking when I had the opportunity to do my PhD at Deakin with David, as in start looking at why this was the case, why Turkey had 70 years of probably back that time 2015 is probably 65 years to be technically correct, why it was always in these cycles of political crisis, political violence, economic crisis, obviously number of coups that you would probably, many of you might know, and really ask that question of why after 70 years there was a failure to consolidate democracy, why it was going through these cycles of crisis. And I looked at the role of elites and undertook a very long, vast, expansive historical analysis, looking back to the beginning of multi-party politics until today. And even if anyone reads the book, the epilogue is pretty much, I was finishing off the epilogue just before it went to print, so it's pretty up to date. So 1950 to now 2023. And what I found was, indeed, Erdogan is a strong man of politics, an authoritarian leader, and under him, in Turkey's democracy, well, it is no longer a democracy; it's some form of authoritarianism. But he is only a manifestation of a political cultural crisis, which is this never-ending pattern of authoritarianism and strongman leadership. And so I set out to look at uncovering how this has impacted democracy. And what I obviously found was that, leaders throughout Turkey's history have been monumental in the way that it has, in their part in shaping democracy. And that includes its crises, it includes conditions that led to coups, inviting the military into politics and so forth. So I think that's the main thing that we need to get out of this book, is that Erdogan is not unique in Turkey's history, even though for a number of years it's been a very sexy topic in media and international affairs. Yes, he is a very hard man, very authoritarian, and pretty much what I say in the last paragraphs of the book, he is an unashamed enemy of democracy. But this is obviously, it's obvious, but when you scratch beneath the surface, all these key leaders Turkey's had have always been authoritarian. And I think when David and I sit down for a chat, we'll sort of tease out these patterns and examples of this. So I think this is where else we'll leave and stop this opening monologue, and can sit down with David and we could flesh these out. And of course, if you've got any more questions, please do ask them. Thanks, Alistair.
Hi, Tez. Well, firstly, I think it's fair to get emotional. First book, it's a big deal. And it was also, as you said, a number of years, probably four or more years. And as you said, a very tense year there during the attempted coup in 2016, yes, where I wasn't treating you to come home.
Can I also say, I think what I wanted to get at is, and I think anyone that's done any large body of work knows that it's never an individual achievement, it's an achievement, it's a team that makes it happen. From David to, you know, my girlfriend was kind enough to proofread, edit the book, to people like William, and that helped along the way, to my best friend Con, you know, like just being that emotional support and so forth. So that's what
it takes a small village, doesn't it? So I think, Tez, with that opening in mind, where I'd like to start is I found that what a really interesting element or facet of the book that you've produced is that you looked at two interwoven dynamics that were taking place. You looked at intra-party and inter-party dynamics. And I wanted to get your sense of why was it important to get that granular view by looking at the intra-party as well as the inter-party, and what was born out of doing that sort of dual exploration?
Yeah, it's a good question, David. I think not many people focus on intra-party rule. So what intra-party for people might not be aware of that term or come from outside political science is, you know, the governing inside the party, the culture of governing, the structure of governing and leadership. And everyone sort of looks at the inter-party space, so the broader politics. And that's easy to point to and say, yeah, there's this authoritarian pattern, but really to enrich for me, and the argument of there is this pattern that exists, is I really want to get in there and show how it manifests inside the party. And what this does is when you're an authoritarian leader over your party, when your party has lack of democratic structure or undemocratic structure, you hold, as a leader, you hold all the power. So you're able to wield that party according to your personal interests. And then what we see is how this mirrors itself when these leaders are in government. And so they are able to rule over their parliamentary majority, their party, and enact laws and legislation and so forth, and without any checks and balances. Yeah, so I really wanted to really enrich that argument and show how there's this interplay between inter-party and intra-party spheres. Yeah, so that's really about it. And I think it would have been a much shorter book, or the thesis would have only been halfway if I only focused on what was happening in the broader political sphere. Because it shows you how each of these leaders really were constantly purging any challenges inside their party. And I think this really sets up this pattern and I think we'll get to looking at not just Erdogan, but Kılıçdaroğlu, the presidential opposition candidate, how this is still, you know, is observable even as democratic as they paint themselves to be, that you really need to look at how really democratic are these people? Let's look at the way they govern their parties. And what you find out is, okay, well, it's really telling that how they govern their parties shows you how democratic or undemocratic that they are.
I want to pick up on a couple of things there. You sort of said that there's a byplay between the intra-party dynamic and the inter-party, and you mentioned purging, which I think is really important. So could you give an example perhaps of one of these situations with the intra-party where you have this sort of disagreement? What's the outcome of that? And then you can maybe talk about how that flows on into the inter-party domain.
Yeah, so how this happens is, so as soon as there's this word in Turkish called tek adam. So it's the strong man or single man culture. And in Turkish political culture, what is a tradition is most of these leaders, when they have that seat of power in their party, they will never really allow anyone that's to come close enough. So ikinci adam, as what we'd say in Turkish, or second man, to have enough power to challenge them. Of course, there's examples that are contrary to this, but they're unique examples. And the moment there is even a faction, and no matter how big this faction is, that challenges their rule, this faction is purged or looked to be purged and marginalized. And this in the book, Demirel, Süleyman Demirel, who was a very, very powerful figure and very long-lasting figure of Turkish politics from the 1960s to pretty much the very early 2000s, that he was mainstay of Turkish politics. You know, there was a point where in the 60s, that he purged such large numbers that they ended up voting against him to bring down his government. And it actually, instead of, I guess, and this is the other lesson I try to give in the book, is that as authoritarian as you want, the more you try to hold that iron fist, the more instability it causes around you. Because you're constantly purging, you're getting rid of people, and have I gone off the topic? No.
Purging. I was very much interested in purging. Yes. So like you're saying, and that,
yes, the other example of that you see is this: there's constant party schisms, fragmentation. So just to give you one key example, is Turkish multi-party politics started with a breakaway from the Republican People's Party, so the CHP, the founding party of the state, which was a Democrat party. So you have these constant schisms and breakaways. I'll give you a current example now, the six-party alliance. So Gelecek Partisi, Deva Partisi, both are created by main politicians who are with the AKP and left the AKP because they couldn't get along with Erdogan. Meral Akşener was purged out of the Nationalist Movement Party. She started her own party, AIIA Party, or the Good Party. So half that table was made up of breakaway parties because they were basically pushed out, forced out. So that leaves no room for leadership renewal.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So you're saying there's constant purges, there's constant schisms. And so the ultimate result of that is that they don't brook any challenge. So the only solution is that if you want to go and do something, you have to go and forge your own party. Yeah. So what do you see? That's one of the, I guess, the discernible patterns that come out of that long view that you've done by looking through each of the key periods. What do you see as the net result of this for Turkish political culture? What has this done to the political landscape? Perhaps could you speak to that somewhat, and what you think? What does it mean for the people that there's this constant rotation, if you like, of parties, rise and fall of parties?
Yeah, it just becomes there's a lack of stability in the political landscape. I mean, here we're very fortunate enough. I mean, maybe you might call it unfortunate. We have a two-party system that seems stable, and it becomes a competition of ideas, whether you're left, right, or whether those lines exist. But in Turkey, it becomes a battle between personalities, a battle between authoritarian tendencies, egos, and what happens is competition of ideas. What we take for granted in liberal democratic settings or consolidated democracies, it's sort of pushed away to the side. It's maybe used as a political vehicle for the leader to attain a position of power, but it's more becomes a landscape where it is dominated by personalities and strongman personalities. And I think when we look at 1970s Turkey and this contest between two very young, ambitious and authoritarian leaders in Demirel and Bülent Ecevit, one is sitting on the right of the spectrum and one on the left. That competition for power, the constant changing of government and trying to remove the other one from government was followed basically by their followers in society and led to political violence and lots of murders and killings between left and right activists. 70s onwards. So yeah, it becomes a very much, so what happens, it removes this idea of consensus and compromise-driven politics, what's very key to democracy, where you see your opponent as an existential threat to you, and then that sort of is very, very harmful for politics, but also society. And I think that 1970s Turkey is a prime example of that.
So picking up on that, you're saying this idea of existential threat, and as you said, consensus. I think that speaks to the idea of the rules of the game. So do you think that obviously there hasn't been sort of an adherence, generally speaking, to the rules of the game and the sort of unwritten convention, if you like, in relation to democratic polities, what you need to do?
So I guess this authoritarian culture and this pattern sits in opposition to democratic ideals and values. So you can have the best constitutions, the best, in theory, best institutional structures, democratic institutions. But if those political elites that have such centralized power do not adhere to those values, do not want to play by those rules, and then it sort of ends up, basically eroding democracy. It ends up eroding those institutions. So I'll give you an example. In 1960 coup, the military wrote one of the most liberal constitutions, probably the most liberal constitution in Turkish history, but even at the time was up there with very Western democratic constitutions, so Western European constitutions. Strong checks on the executive, strong autonomy to civil society, universities, and so forth. Now, Demirel, who was the prime minister from 65 to 1970, he made a constant habit of attacking the constitution, trying to legitimize it, saying, blaming it for the ills of the country, saying that the reason that there was such high leftist activism was because it was the constitution to blame. So he never by delegitimizing it and refused to play by those I guess those bounds that were set for him. I think that what I sort of show in the book is he created instability in the political order. So you can have, as I said, in theory, the best constitutions, the best institutions, but if those elites are unwilling to play by those rules, then it doesn't really matter. So I think we only have to look at someone like Trump in recent example, where having a constitution like the US and division of powers, how much damage he did in over 4 years because of undemocratic behavior. So I think if I was to sort of show an example of people that can connect with today, that would be something like that. Yeah.
Well, I think it's a good segue. It's a good segue into my next question. I think another fascinating element of the book is that you argue, and you preface this in your opening statement, that basically Erdogan is not sort of something that came a bolt from the blue. He's very much a product of the Turkish political system and the culture that has developed over an extended period of time. And so I was wondering if maybe you could sort of elaborate on this and maybe provide some more formative examples of what led to the Erdogan that we know today.
Yeah, so I guess you want me to touch upon some prior examples of what's happening today, but previously. So I think one of the main ones, key one is Turgut Özal, Prime Minister in the post-coup period, post-80 coup period, then climbed to the presidency in the late 80s until his unfortunate death in the early 1990s. But what he tried to do was similar to what Erdogan has been able to establish now through de facto, then through a constitutional change in executive presidency. I don't want to even get into what Özal was doing as a prime minister, how authoritarian he was, some very, I would just say examples of very undemocratic behavior, but just to cut my answer short, he very much made a concerted effort to try running the parliamentary government from his presidential seat. Now, prior to the constitution change over the last couple of a few years ago, the presidency was more of a ceremonial position. So the head of government was a prime minister. Now, there were strong bounds, constitutional bounds. When you are president, you should be apolitical. You don't interfere in the day-to-day affairs of any political party or in government. But when Özal went in there, he was actually using his control over the Motherland Party, who was in government, to try running the government and the presidency at the same time. And he actually wanted to change the constitution, but he just didn't have the parliamentary numbers to push to a referendum. But there were de facto or informal ways he was trying to control the government from behind the scenes. And it got to a point, and just before he passed away, he was actually going to, he concocted a number of resignations from the party because he felt that he wasn't able to control it. So because he was so irritated by this fact, and he felt that the party that he created owes it to him, that they should be much more compliant, that he actually concocted or designed, was an architect in a number of resignations. And his aim was to step down from the presidency and create a new party and then be able to win another election and go back to being prime minister. But he ended up passing away from a heart attack before he could do that. What else? Çiller, Tansu Çiller was, I won't get too much into Tansu Çiller, but when Tansu Çiller ruled over Turkey, Turkey really descended into a dark period, and very much connections between I guess criminal networks and governments, arbitrary killings, systematic killings of human rights activists in the name of fighting against terrorism or the PKK. And so she led it very highly into unstable coalition governments that would sort of pretty much fall as soon as that they were created. And very corrupt figure of Turkish politics. What she did was that what Erdogan has also done now is remove the immunities of 10 Kurdish pro-Kurdish party politicians and then throw them into jail. So this was something that we see that wasn't just something that's unique to Erdogan, that was, was set precedence by Çiller. The attacks on media, jailing of media was huge in the 1950s under Adnan Menderes of government, so the Democrat Party. So the first democratic government of Turkey, ironically named Democrat Party, which were completely undemocratic. And so it got to a point that there was so many journalists in jail that they called this jail in Ankara the Ankara Hilton. And there was legislation that was enacted that really curbed the right of media and journalists, especially in the late 50s. So these things are, as I show in the book, is something that's new with Erdogan. They've happened before, and people that came before and pushed the envelope a little bit, and he sort of completely threw that envelope off the table.
Mm. Yeah, so basically, I think what you've outlined there, you could say that over the decades, the playbook was written by Menderes, by Özal and Çiller, by media suppression. We had trying to bend the presidency to the will, or sort of politicize the presidency, because he said it was a ceremonial role. Largely, it wasn't supposed to be a sort of a political role per se.
Well, I'll give you one example, Turgut Özal. I mean, he blatantly came out and said, what does it matter if I break the constitution once? So, that was his way. I mean, Turgut Özal, a lot of these characters, whether if you sit on the left, center left, or you're traditionally a Republican People's Party voter, or you come from that family, you're going to see Ecevit as this light of democracy. If you come from the center right tradition, you're going to see Menderes as being, like a forefather, or a key person in democracy, and someone that should be not idolized but looked up to. Same with Demirel. But so when you take an objective look, you see that, you know, all had very harmful behavior and characteristics, harmful towards democracy, and did a lot of damage in certain periods of their rule. I think I went off track.
No, that's all right. No, as I was saying, just adding to the point, as I said, the playbook has been written.
Yes.
So I think one of the interesting things as well, then, you mentioned the epilogue as well with Erdogan. So why, if you had Özal, obviously he passed away unexpectedly, but certainly Chile did lift immunity, and you did have suppression under Menderes.
Yeah.
What has sort of been the dynamic that has seen Erdogan be so successful, more successful, as you said, go beyond what any other sort of leader has, given that the playbook was written, but he's really mastered the playbook? And so maybe you could sort of give some thoughts on why has he been successful in sort of breaking the system or bending the system to his will?
Is it? We could answer. I could definitely answer that in a number of ways. He's definitely a charismatic leader, a very politically shrewd actor, a political animal. And what Erdogan, I guess, his appeal to the masses, to the majority of people, is for over 20 years, connect with him. He knows how to play the identity card extremely well. He knows that when he plays that card, the identity that connects with him, maybe the more conservative, more religious, he has the majority. And he's very, very happy to play those two sides off against one another. So the polarization has worked for him. I mean, he's been in power for 20 years, so, or just over 20 years. So given someone that much, such a long time, and to have such centralized power, and to have an undemocratic character, I think this is just going to be the natural sort of course in the long run. That doesn't say that, I don't mean to say that maybe these other people that I mentioned, write about in the book, if they were in power for 20 years, it might have happened as well. But I mean, the Menderes government was really in those 10 years going towards that, and the military saw it was the only stop that could actually, only institution that could put a stop to that. And so they resolved it in their own way. And I'm not excusing what the military did, or, you know, in the way they in enacting a coup or start, you know, jumping into politics. But and I just want to say that that's how far Turkey had gone down the authoritarian path in the 1950s, because the military thought it was the only way to stop that was to step into politics. And unfortunately, what happened was unfortunate. You know, the death penalty given to him and two of his colleagues, you know, and hung. So in that sense, like I said, you know, Erdogan's been successful for a number of factors, and you know, he's been able to success with that clientelistic networks, patronage, and you know, and the way he speaks and relates to the everyday Turk. You know, he's been very successful at that.
You mentioned the military, and obviously being sort of the secular sort of guardian, if you like, of the state for a long time. How much of a tipping point, how important was the sort of breaking of the military tutelage through the cases of Ergenekon and then later Balyoz, which is Sledgehammer, during that period of around 2007 through 2013? Yeah,
I get to that point in the book where he had captured pretty much all institutions, and then the one key institution that Erdogan was probably right in thinking, given the history of the military, to remove was the military tutelage in politics. And I think this was one key way. It was the key way of purging the military of anti-Erdogan actors, as we see with those two cases. And once you were able to remove the institution's power, So the military's power in politics, I think, was pretty much an open road for him to enact, changes in the constitution, and overtake the judiciary, really suppress the media, and so forth. So I think from that point on, we really see a quicker slide to where we are today.
Another great segue. So fast forwarding, because I'm mindful of the time. So, so moving to current events, obviously, as you said, Erdogan's been in power now for over 20 years. He's built up this almost juggernaut where he's captured all the institutions. He's constantly, routinely purged any opposition. As you said, they've now gone and formed opposition parties, which is very much a continuation of that cycle that you've described. So is there any hope? There was a lot of optimism leading up to the election that the National Alliance of the 6 different parties, particularly the Nationalist Party, along with AIIA Party, and then Babacan and Davutoglu, with
also backed by the pro-Kurdish party, HDP, or
with the Left Green Party as the proxy.
Yeah.
So and there right just before the election, there was a bit of a fracas that took place in terms of Meral Akşener wanting to step away, and there was concerns around the capacity of, say, Kılıçdaroğlu to win. And we know that historically, around 25% of the vote goes to the CHP, or the Republican People's Party. And so she was saying, I'm going to step away because I think obviously there's other people like Mansur Yavaş and İmamoğlu, the 2 mayors, who are very popular, and was advocating on their behalf. And then a deal was brokered where that they would be vice presidents if he was successful. So it's sort of a halfway step. What are your thoughts on this kind of dynamic, and in what way is this sort of dynamic a manifestation of many of the problems that you described in the book in terms of the internal party problems, intra-party problems, and in what way did this hinder any possible salvo from the opposition?
Yeah, I think there was this, just to sort of expand upon that, there was this talk that, if Kılıçdaroğlu wins, then maybe what does that say about your book, and is this going to be a change in which is fine. I mean, it's actually legitimate observation. And I've always, I come from my family, and I've said this in a podcast, so it's not hidden knowledge, that my family invited Bülent Ecevit to their wedding in 1976 because they're working class people, and they loved him because the working class masses in the 70s adored Ecevit, and pretty much throughout until his death. He was a man of the working class, the unions, and so forth. But I don't have those affinities to any party, so I was very comfortable in being critical of everyone. So I took a scattergun to everyone and was critical. So I think that's the strength of that book. The book is I never approached it with a partisan ideology and then let that bleed into my analysis. So the way I look at the Kılıçdaroğlu, just getting back to Kılıçdaroğlu, is the same. Kılıçdaroğlu was elected the head of the main opposition in 2010 unopposed. So I don't know how, obviously that's not very democratic when you don't have a opposing candidate. Now, he has lost countless elections. He hasn't been able to, as leader, hasn't been able to push the CHP's votes beyond 25% at max. And he has consistently refused to step down from leadership. And I think, again, it goes back to what I said. I have to hand it to him. He has a very democratic outward demeanor. It's very soft-spoken, and he comes across as a very true Democrat. But as I said, we need to look back at how he governs the party. Now, again, he's lost this election, and again, he has not even acknowledged that there needs to be self-reflection, self-criticism, renewal within the party. And a lot of people, when you look at social media, Twitter, there's criticism is divided between, well, this is the best that the opposition could have done, and because it's a highly unfair and unfree. I think there's this thing is, well, the elections are unfair, but they're free. They're not free at all in Turkey. they're unfair as well. That you know, that's all they can do. But there's the other thing is, which I sort of, the stream I come from is, you have constant polls showing that you have the two mayors, elected mayors of Ankara and Istanbul, İmamoğlu and Yavaş, as leading the polls against Erdogan. You even have Meral Akşener, who's from the centre-right party, was third popular leader, and Kılıçdaroğlu was coming fourth. But he was adamant that, I think it's hubris, it was naivety, where he thought the economy is going this bad, there's the earthquake, and this is my chance to really come and win. This is the moment I've been waiting for. He believed his own, I guess, in a circle of advisors. He believed his own, what he was seeing by internal pollsters, and he basically elbowed his way into to be the candidate. And at the same time, I think he made, obviously this is just an observation. I'd love to do research on this and interview people in the six-party alliance. It seemed that he made this deal with other members of the six party, saying, hey, look, if you back me, this is the payoff is going to be that X number of seats in Parliament for you. So he really, you know, I think made some electorally rational decisions because of out of self-interest. And I think obviously he failed. And again, another election lost. And I think it's just been bad leadership on his behalf, and he's refused to step down again. I mean, these elections it's not the first time Turkey's elections have been unfree and unfair. You've had a track record of these since 2015. So if you cannot learn from these mistakes and come up with counter strategies, then you're doing something wrong as a leader. And so, you know, and I think you need to be able to step away from the party leadership and let it renew new ideas, generate new ideas, like new generation of leaders to come through, and maybe give them a go. But in Turkish politics, as you know, this talk and this book has shown, there is an absolute deficiency in that type of action and thought. So I am, you know, in that sense, critical of Kılıçdaroğlu, and I think he just feeds into that. Yes, he's a much more softer, mild-mannered man. He hasn't seemed to have any corruption allegations against him and so forth. He's very clean in that sense. But, you know, is he the true Democrat that he is labelling himself up? I'll give you an example as another way. So he had this, you know, very inclusive campaign in the lead up to first election, presidential election, and he lost, you know, he went to a runoff, and his demeanor completely changed in the second runoff. He became pro-nationalist, anti-immigrants. You know, this grandfather, Dede, as they called him, he became the working class hero and inclusive Democrat. All of a sudden, overnight, he was this right-wing nationalist, anti-immigrant. So, you know, that says a lot about his principles, and he's a populist. So he might not be, again, the manner in what Erdogan is outwardly, but he's still, you know, he's got very, you know, the very populist way of, you know, of saying and doing and rhetoric and narrative and so forth. He just doesn't, you can't do it as good as Erdogan.
And still holding on for dear life in terms of not brooking any idea of resigning, I think.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah.
I think just two more things to finish off before we open it up to the floor. So I think you mentioned that obviously it's not a free and fair election. I think that's a really good point to emphasize. And there's been some talk about how that it was engineered in some ways, designed, the opposition was engineered to fail, in the sense that İmamoğlu was ruled out with a court case that was brought against him for insulting, I think it was at the higher election authority. Over the reset mayoral election of 2019, I think it was. So, and so he was ruled out. So in some ways, do you see it was that sort of Erdogan maneuvering to try and keep Kılıçdaroğlu at the helm, because obviously that was a much easier path to victory?
Yeah, there is that. I mean, we don't want to fall into conspiracy theories here, but it looked like there was definitely, Erdogan he ran against the man that he wanted. And he knew that he would always defeat Kılıçdaroğlu because he's always defeated Kılıçdaroğlu. By locking up someone like Selahattin Demirtas from, he's unfortunately stepped away from active politics, he's resigned, so I don't know if anyone is aware. On Twitter, he's sort of his legal team, I think obviously he, using his quotes, quoting him, saying that he's stepping away. So 7 years ago, threw him in jail because he was one of the key, I think, lights leaders to be able to oppose Erdogan. Then you had İmamoğlu, who was extremely dynamic. All the polls showed how popular he is. And I think I have to say, İmamoğlu is, in my studies, is the most dynamic politician I've seen. And so he is someone really to look out for in future Turkish politics. And I think Erdogan knew that because he comes from the same region as Erdogan. He knows religion back to front. He connects with the everyday person in Turkey. He knows how to use those cultural symbols to be able to talk to people. And you see this when you see him out in the markets. So he's very, very likable by all facets most facets of Turkish society. And I think Erdogan realized that by, using the judiciary to basically throw him, well, he's been handed down 2.5 years jail, but hasn't been certified by the courts. It's on appeal, yeah. So it hasn't been certified, but given that judiciary is under Erdogan's control, then it's more than likely that he will unfortunately be in jail for 2.5 years. So what was left was, Kılıçdaroğlu, it sort of made it easy for Kılıçdaroğlu to be able to grab that the candidature, because obviously it was something that he was very, very adamant about.
So you could say perhaps played someone into his hubris.
Oh, easy, yeah.
Well, anyway, you're saying that obviously that İmamoğlu is perhaps a leading light, perhaps going forward, notwithstanding the sort of Damocles over his head of a 2.5-year jail sentence.
I mean, but Erdogan went in jail for 9 months, but and he wasn't able to run as become prime minister. But the AKP and CHP worked together in the early periods of the first term of the AKP's government to provide amnesty for him and change the law so he can actually become prime minister. So that leads into my final question. So trying to be a little bit upbeat because of obviously the deflation that everyone's had with all the optimism leading up to the finishing it in the first round, which didn't happen. So just a little bit of blue sky. I know we always try to avoid too much blue sky thinking, but what do you see as possibly the way forward now that we've got another 5 years of Erdogan? So we've got that, but what lies beyond, do you think? I'll just get my crystal ball out. If that's a good question, I don't know. I don't see the opposition getting the upper hand electorally anytime soon. What I see is, I see Erdogan as physically very frail. He's definitely not the Erdogan of yesteryear. He's old man, but it's more than being old. He does not look at full health. And we've seen many examples of that on interviews, or when he's walking, he needs to be sort of maybe helped up as in, so he doesn't sort of sway. I don't know whether he's going to have the capacity to run the country for the next 5 years. And if he's in power, I don't see the opposition getting up against him. He's just got too much appeal. The AKP, maybe not so, but he is bigger than the AKP. So I don't see that changing. I don't know. I don't see any blue skies.
So much for trying to finish on an upbeat.
And I don't know what will happen when, given that, and this happens all the time, given that there's such centralized power in his hands, like this man controls the state, the government out of his office. When he is no longer there, that vacuum, that's something to be very
watchful of.
Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know if İmamoğlu is going to be going away for 2.5 years. If that's the case, if he's banned from politics, if Demirtas is, I don't know if he'll ever be out in Erdogan's lifetime. these very, very strong leaders, opposition leaders that would be able to challenge Erdogan's popularity, especially Imamoglu. Yeah, I don't know who else there can be. There definitely, I think the opposition will always be active, will always keep a space to be active and constantly push back, but it's always going to be up against it. And that's not going to change anytime soon. And from what I hear, there's murmuring that Erdogan's going to try changing the constitution again. So
there's also been murmurings of trying to maybe some sort of handover or something like that.
Yeah, if that happens, it's not going to last. And I think this is what I didn't touch upon. So when you look at because there's no leadership renewal over parties, when a leader leaves politics, they pretty much party goes with them. So when we look at Turgut Özal, when he passed away in '93, the Motherland Party pretty much disappeared. When Demirel went to presidency and handed over the True Path Party to Çiller, it sort of very much withered away in time over a few years. When Erdogan passed away, his religious parties pretty much are now like bouncing between 0.5 and 1%. Yeah. His son's now created another party on his own. So what you see is, that movement, that political movement, ends up leaving or disintegrating as when the leader goes or dies, or yeah.
Okay. Well, I was hoping to do it on an upbeat note, but perhaps we have to look a bit further forward to find that. So thanks so much.
Don't read my book then.
Thanks so much.